It began with a sound that did not belong to the world John knew. On a humid August night in 1997, the familiar chorus of crickets and rustling leaves that usually lulled Mason Hollow to sleep was torn apart by a long, low howl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of his farmhouse. John was sitting on his porch, a half-whittled piece of cherry wood in his hand, when the sound rolled down from the dark, tree-choked hills. It was not the bay of a coonhound or the cry of a distant coyote. This was something else entirely, a deep, guttural ululation that carried a strange, almost intelligent sorrow. It was a sound that felt ancient, a noise that predated the fences and the gravel roads and the quiet, stubborn lives of the people in the hollow. He sat frozen, the whittling knife still in his grip, as the echo died away, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more profound than before. The night itself seemed to be holding its breath. Through the screen door, he could hear the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the passage of a normal evening that had just been irrevocably severed from normality. He stood, the wooden chair groaning in protest, and walked to the edge of the porch, peering into the wall of darkness that was the forest. The moon was a thin, pale sliver, offering little light, and the trees were a solid mass of deeper black. He saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched, of being studied by something hidden in that impenetrable gloom, settled over him like a cold mist. The next morning, under a sun that seemed too bright and cheerful, the memory of the sound clung to him. He went about his chores with a distracted air, the bleating of his sheep and the clucking of the chickens failing to shake the unease that had taken root in his gut. It was at Miller's General Store, while picking up a new sack of feed, that he finally gave voice to it. Leaning against the worn wooden counter, he mentioned the strange howl to Old Man. Miller himself, the storekeeper, a man whose family had been in the hollow for generations, stopped polishing a glass and fixed John with a thoughtful, wary gaze. He didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window and the mountains beyond. By that afternoon, the story had traveled. It was on the lips of the women hanging laundry in their backyards and the men gathered around the engine of Billy Cooper's broken-down truck. Whispers of the Mason howl began to blend with older stories, tales passed down from grandparents about the things that lived in the deep woods before the mines and the farms. They spoke of the Shawnee legends of a protector spirit and the darker, more recent tales from coal miners about a dark man who watched from the ridges. John's single, unsettling experience became a kind of kindling, igniting a low, smoldering fear that had been sleeping in the hollow for decades. The peaceful mountain town, once defined by the predictable rhythm of the seasons, was now listening to the wind with a new, fearful attention, waiting for a sound that did not belong. The dread that had been seeded by the unearthly howl took root and bloomed in the stark light of a Tuesday morning. John made his rounds at dawn, the dew soaking his boots as he trudged toward the lower pasture where his prize ewes were kept. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, a pastoral scene that shattered the moment he crested the small hill. There in the center of the green field lay a dark, sprawling stain. As he drew closer, his pace quickening from a walk to a stumbling run, the stain resolved into a horror of crimson and ruin. One of his sheep, a sturdy ewe named Bess, lay torn open. The carnage was not that of a coyote or a bear, it was surgical in its brutality. The animal had been eviscerated with a precision that spoke of terrifying strength, its internal organs removed and laid carefully to one side. Untouched, yet there was no blood on them, as if they had been cleaned before being placed there. The ground around the carcass was a churned-up mess of mud and gore, but the most chilling detail was the utter lack of tracks. No paw prints, no boot marks, nothing to suggest how the killer had approached or departed. It was as if death had descended from the sky and vanished back into it. John's shout brought his neighbors running, and soon a small, horrified crowd stood in a silent semicircle around the mutilated animal. The initial shock gave way to a low, anxious murmur. This was not the work of any natural predator they knew. Sheriff Roy Daniels arrived, his cruiser kicking up gravel on the dirt track. He was a pragmatic man, built solid and slow, but his usual calm demeanor faltered as he surveyed the scene. He and his deputy spent over an hour on their hands and knees, searching for any scrap of evidence. They found nothing. No hair, no fibers, no disturbed earth beyond the immediate kill zone. The sheriff stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, his face a grim mask of frustrated confusion. He had no explanation to offer, no comforting lie to tell. The news spread through Mason Hollow like a fever. The abstract fear born from a strange sound had now been given a name, a face of blood and viscera. Doors that were usually left unlocked were now bolted shut before sunset. Parents called their children in from playing in the yards as dusk began to bleed into the trees. And the stories started again, but they were different now, sharper and more personal. Old Mrs. Gable reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure moving between the pines behind her house, its gait all wrong, a loping, disjointed stride. The Henderson boys, coming home late from a fishing trip, swore they heard something heavy and fast moving through the underbrush just off the trail, keeping pace with them until they broke into a panicked run for their porch light. Paranoia became the town's currency, traded in whispers over coffee and across fence lines. Every creak of a settling house, every hoot of an owl was now a potential herald of the thing in the woods. The mystery was no longer a subject of curious folklore. It was a palpable, lurking threat that had tasted blood and left no trace. The quiet hollow, once a sanctuary, now felt like a settlement under a silent, invisible siege. The worn pews of the Mason Hollow Community Church were filled with a nervous energy that seemed to hum in the still, dusty air. It was the first time in living memory that a town meeting had been called for something other than a harvest festival or a road repair. The grim faces, lit by the weak yellow glow of the overhead lights, were a mosaic of shared fear. John sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, the image of Bess's mutilated body still seared behind his eyes. Sheriff Daniels stood before the assembled residents, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, the weight of their collective anxiety pressing down on him. One by one they rose to speak, their voices a mixture of tremulous uncertainty and grim conviction. Sarah Phelps, who lived in the old cabin at the edge of the national forest, described seeing it just 2 nights prior. She had been taking out the trash when a feeling of being watched, so intense it felt like a physical touch, had made her look up. There, standing just within the tree line, was a tall, impossibly thin silhouette, darker than the surrounding night. It stood perfectly still, she said, but she had the distinct, chilling impression that it was watching her house, studying it. She fled inside, locking the door and spending the rest of the night huddled in her kitchen, a butcher knife gripped in her hand. Then it was old Elias McCullough's turn. He leaned heavily on his cane as he stood, his voice a dry rasp that commanded silence. He spoke not of what he had seen, but of what his own grandfather had told him, tales of. The Fachin, a creature from the old country, a thing of 1 leg, 1 arm, and 1 eye that watched from the high places. Others countered with local Shawnee lore, whispers of a forest spirit that punished those who trespassed too deeply into its domain. A heated debate erupted, a clash between cold, hard reality and the dark soil of folklore. The younger generation, represented by a frustrated mechanic named Dave, argued for rational explanations. A bear, a diseased coyote, anything but a monster. But their arguments faltered against the sheer weight of the accounts, the lack of tracks, the precision of the kill, the consistent description of a tall, shadowy watcher. The fear in the room became a tangible thing, a thick fog of dread that made the air hard to breathe. It was a fear of the unknown, of the dark spaces on the map that were suddenly, terrifyingly alive. John finally stood, his own quiet authority silencing the room. He didn't speak of legends or myths, he spoke of his sheep, his land, and the need to protect their homes. He proposed a watch, a rotation of armed volunteers who would patrol the perimeter of the town each night, focusing on the properties that bordered the dense woods. It was a desperate measure, a return to a more primal form of community defense. By the end of the evening, a list of names was scrawled on a piece of notepaper. John, Dave the mechanic, a few other sturdy men and women, all bound by a shared, unspoken understanding. They were no longer just neighbors, they were sentinels on the edge of the light, staring out into a darkness that had begun to stare back. As the meeting adjourned and people filed out into the cool night, their gazes were drawn not to the star-dusted sky, but to the black line of the forest, a wall of secrets that now held a new, chilling resident. The community had drawn a line in the dirt, but they all wondered with a cold knot in their stomachs which side of that line they were truly on. Encroaching dusk painted the world in shades of bruised purple and deep blue, a time when solid shapes began to bleed into shadows and the familiar landscape of John's farm felt foreign and treacherous. He walked the fence line, the weight of the loaded shotgun in his hands a cold, metallic comfort. It was his turn on the watch, the first patrol born from the town meeting's fearful resolve. The air was still, the usual evening chorus of insects and frogs eerily absent, as if the very forest was holding its breath. His boots crunched on the gravel path that skirted the edge of his property, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. His eyes, strained and tired, scanned the darkening tree line, searching for any movement, any break in the pattern of trunks and leaves that did not belong. He reached the old oak that marked the corner of his land, its gnarled branches clawing at the twilight sky. It was here, where the pasture met the untamed woods, that a primal instinct, older than reason, screamed a warning in the base of his skull. The hair on his arms and the back of his neck stood erect. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and slowly, against every screaming fiber of his being, he turned his head. There, standing between two slender pines not 30 yards away, was the Watcher. It was taller than any man, a column of solidified shadow so deep and dark it seemed to drink the fading light from the air around it. Its form was unnaturally slender, a grotesque parody of a human silhouette with limbs that were too long and too thin. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in John's veins. They were not reflections, they generated their own sickly, phosphorescent light, two pinpricks of a pale, hateful yellow that burned with a cold and ancient intelligence. They were fixed directly on him, and in their glow John felt not just seen but known, his fears, his history, his very soul laid bare and judged. A silent communication passed between them. In that frozen second, a wave of pure, predatory malevolence that washed over John and stripped away all thought, all courage, leaving only the raw, animal imperative to flee. The creature took a single, fluid step forward. It made no sound, its movement a whisper of displaced air, a motion that was both graceful and utterly wrong, the loping, disjointed stride the others had described. The glowing eyes narrowed slightly, and a low, guttural sound, not a growl but something deeper and more resonant, vibrated through the ground and up through the soles of John's boots. The spell broke. A strangled gasp tore from John's lips as he stumbled backward, the forgotten shotgun falling from his numb fingers to clatter on the stones. He did not think to retrieve it. He did not think at all. His body acted on an instinct millennia old, spinning him around and propelling him back toward the distant, golden square of his farmhouse kitchen window. He ran, his heart a frantic, painful drum. Against his ribs, his lungs burning with ragged, panicked breaths. He did not look back. He could feel those glowing eyes boring into his back, a tangible pressure urging him faster, faster. The world blurred into a smear of dark fields and the thunder of his own flight. He hit the porch steps at a full sprint, the screen door screaming as he wrenched it open and fell into the blessed, electric light of his home, slamming the solid oak door behind him and throwing the deadbolt with trembling, fumbling hands. He stood there, back pressed against the wood, his body shaking uncontrollably, the image of those terrible, knowing eyes seared permanently into his mind. The myth was no longer a story. It was real, and it had looked him in the face. Word of John's encounter spread through Mason Hollow before the sun had fully set, carried on a current of pure, undiluted terror. The line between whispered folklore and tangible menace, once blurred, was now erased completely. The creature had witness, a reliable man, a pillar of the community. Hysteria, once a simmering pot, now boiled over. That night no one patrolled. Shotguns were propped by front doors, and families huddled together in their living rooms, listening to the darkness outside with a new, paralyzing fear. The thing in the woods was no longer just a watcher. It had stepped out of the trees, and the town knew with a chilling certainty that it was only a matter of time before it stepped closer still. The dawn after John's encounter broke over a town gripped by a fever of fear, but it also brought a grim and desperate resolve. Sheriff Daniels, his face etched with new lines of worry, organized the largest search party Mason Hollow had ever seen. Nearly every able-bodied man and woman gathered in the gravel lot outside the sheriff's station, their faces set in grim masks, an arsenal of hunting rifles, shotguns, and high-powered flashlights held in white-knuckled grips. They moved into the woods like a nervous army, a line of determined humanity pushing back against the oppressive silence of the trees. They combed every inch of the forest surrounding John's property and the other sites of sightings, their calls to one another sounding thin and brittle in the vast, leafy cathedral. They found broken branches and animal trails, a discarded beer can from a decade ago, and the crumbling stone foundation of a homestead long forgotten. But they found no tracks that matched the descriptions of a tall, slender creature, no strange fur caught on bark, no den or lair. The entity, whatever it was, had left no physical evidence of its existence. It was as if the woods themselves had swallowed it whole, erasing all traces of the terror that had stalked their edges. By the time the sun began to dip below the ridge, the search party returned to town, their energy spent, their purpose defeated not by a confrontation, but by a profound and unsettling nothingness. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the summer of fear ended. The howls that had torn the night ceased. The tall, shadowy watcher was seen no more, vanishing from the tree line as if it had never been there. The oppressive silence that had accompanied its presence lifted, and the familiar night sounds of the hollow, the crickets, the frogs, the gentle rustle of leaves, returned, their normalcy now feeling strange and fragile. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a month, with no new mutilations, no more glimpses of glowing eyes in the dark. The tension that had held the town in a vice-like grip slowly began to ease, but it did not break. It settled instead into a deep-seated wariness, a permanent scar on the community's psyche. The nightly watch was quietly disbanded, but the shotguns remained by the doors, and the habit of looking over one's shoulder before stepping out into the twilight became ingrained, a new and somber tradition. Alone on his porch in the deepening quiet of a late September evening, John watched the forest. The vibrant greens of summer were fading into the brilliant golds and reds of autumn, a breathtaking display of beauty that now felt like a mask. He turned the events of the past months over in his mind, examining them from every angle like the strange, river-smoothed stones he sometimes found in his fields. The memory of those glowing eyes was as vivid and chilling as the moment he had seen them, a brand on his soul. Yet in the clear, unyielding light of a peaceful day, a sliver of doubt sometimes wormed its way in. Had it been real, a flesh-and-blood creature of unknown origin, or something else, a shared delirium born from isolation and the power of old stories? The lack of any evidence, the way it had vanished without a trace, lent a surreal, dreamlike quality to the entire ordeal. The truth of Mason Hollow, he realized, would forever be ambiguous, a secret locked within the heart of the woods, a story with no final chapter. The town was forever changed. The easy, open trust that had once defined the hollow was gone, replaced by a cautious reserve. The children, who had once raced through the woods without a care, now played in fenced-in yards, their games tinged with whispers of the dark man. The folklore was no longer just a story to tell around a campfire. It was a part of their history, a dark season woven into the fabric of the place. Mason Hollow had looked into the abyss, and though the abyss had seemingly withdrawn, a part of it had remained behind, reflected in the eyes of its people. They went about their lives, tending their farms and running their stores, but the shadow of the watcher lingered, not in the trees, but in the quiet spaces between their thoughts, a permanent resident in the hollow of their